Hi there. I hope that you're doing well. I know I am because we just had a paper published, which is always great. And in this video, I will tell you all about it. It's a Nordic hamstring exercise study, and it has some real interesting and important clinical relevance, I think. So I hope you enjoy the video. So to begin with, this paper is called Differences in Peak Knee Flexor Force between eccentric only and combined eccentric concentric Nordic hamstring exercise. And it was published yesterday, 7th of February 2023 in the Sports Scientific Journal. And it was authored by Håkan Andersson and myself. And Håkan Andersson, he's an elite sprinter coach in Sweden. So he has decades of experience and knowledge in this department. And it was very nice to write a paper together with Håkan. So a little bit of background for why this study was done then. Hamstring strain injury is one of the most common injury diagnoses in many sports, and at least two clearly different types of hamstring strains have been described in the literature. Firstly, hamstring strains that occur during high-speed running, and secondly, stretching type movements or exercises that lead to a lengthened state of the hamstrings, such as high kicking or slide tackling. So there is evidence that the Nordic hamstring exercise, the NHE, which is a knee flexor exercise, can reduce hamstring injury risk in athletes by half. So this review by Nicole van Dyk et al. This paper has been cited quite a lot in injury prevention research. And in research on hamstring injury prevention, the NHE is typically performed eccentric only, so that an athlete lean forward as far as possible until breakpoint, and then they fall and catch themselves with their hands. And the researchers on the NHE, they often refer to the NHE as an eccentric exercise, which is clearly wrong, because all exercises can be categorized as either static or dynamic and involve muscle actions that are isometric, concentric, and or eccentric. So it's not correct to state that the NHE is an eccentric exercise, because it's not. But it is, however, the way that it has typically been performed in NHE research. And so, because the NHE has only been performed eccentrically in injury prevention research, the effect of eccentric concentric NHE, ECNHE, that is not known. So we don't know what happens, what effect an eccentric concentric NHE has when it comes to the force that is produced when an athlete performs this kind of NHE. And it's of course not known either if the effect of eccentric concentric NHE is any good when it comes to reducing the risk of hamstring strains. So this figure here represents the force velocity curve, and this curve dictates that in maximal efforts, eccentric force will be significantly higher than concentric force, but the difference in force between maximal eccentric and eccentric concentric actions, however, is not as well studied. And so we hypothesized that peak knee flexor force would be higher for ENHE when compared to ECNHE, and further that peak knee flexor force would occur with less amount of forward motion for EC-NHE when compared to E-NHE. And the second purpose of our study was to compare two ways of assessment of force during the NHE. So today's gold standard test system when it comes to the NHE is the NordBord. It's high in cost and only has single use, and it measures knee flexor force through an ankle brace attached atop of a load cell. But we thought that an alternative method might be to assess knee flexor force about the knee joint instead, using a force plate. And a force plate is a device that has multiple uses in sports and research. So that was our second purpose of this study, to compare these two methods of force assessment for the NHE. So again, we hypothesized, and this time we hypothesized that a strong correlation would exist between peak force measured at the ankle using a load cell, that's the NordBord way, and about the knee joint using a force plate for both the E-NHE and the EC-NHE. So for this study, 15 elite athletes competing at both national and international levels volunteered to participate. So they were 3 women, 12 men, 10 of them were soccer players, and the rest 5 participants were track and field athletes. So this figure illustrates the test setup used in this study, where the participants were positioned onto the custom-made Nordic hamstring exercise device. It was built by myself actually, out of wood, a really fun time. And they were positioned on their knees with their ankles secured by straps and arms crossed over their chest. And then we had a linear encoder that measured the position at which peak force occurred during the maximal trials of eccentric only and combined eccentric concentric NHE. And hamstring force was measured at the ankle using a load cell. That's the NordBord method of assessing force when performing an NHE, but force was also assessed about the knee joint using a force plate during these different NHEs. And so this slide shows the results of this study, and the table illustrates the test differences between the two NHE variations. So peak force assessed at the ankle was significantly higher for E-NHE than EC-NHE, 678 newtons versus 600 newton, which is a 12% difference. That was statistically significant. Whereas peak force assessed about the knee joint, in that test mode, the difference between E-NHE and EC-NHE was not statistically different. So it was 640 newton compared to 607. So that was a non-significant 5% difference. And when it came to forward distance achieved, so for this parameter, there was a statistical difference between NHE variation in that for the E-NHE, the forward distance achieved was 74. Peak force occurred at a mean of 74 centimeters, whereas for the EC-NHE, the peak force occurred at 54 centimeters of forward distance achieved, which is a statistically significant difference of 37%. So let's have a look at this figure. It's a representative illustration of a participant that performs the eccentric concentric NHE. So if we have a look at panel A here, we have the participant in the starting position, and then the participant leans forward, and the arrow indicate the maximal forward distance achieved, and then the participant goes back to the starting position. And the panel B illustrates the forces assessed about the knee joint using the force plate, and the arrow indicate the peak force during the NHE, and the panel C illustrates the peak knee flexor force assessed at the ankle using the force sensor for this participant. And what's so interesting with this figure is that we can see that peak knee flexor force occurred at and matched the maximal forward distance achieved, both when assessed using the force plate and using the force sensor for every participant. So peak knee flexor force occurred during the coupling phase, the phase between the eccentric and concentric phases for every participant. And so last but not least, when it comes to the results of this study, this figure illustrates the correlations between peak force assessed at the ankle and about the knee joint for ENHE and EC NHE respectively. And we saw very strong, significant correlations between peak force assessed at the ankle and about the knee joint for both NHE variations. So we had an R of 0.96 and 0.99 respectively between these two methods of assessing force for the NHE. So let's talk a bit about the clinical relevance of this study. So for the EC NHE, peak knee flexor force was reached with 37% less forward movement. That means that this exercise may complement the traditional ENHE. For instance, during hamstring injury rehabilitation, where a position of great knee extension may not be well tolerated by the athlete. So this is essential knowledge, for instance, for a sports physical therapist, and may benefit an athlete in their hamstring rehabilitation progression. And further, assessing knee flexor force about the knee joint using a force plate may provide an alternate to measuring at the ankle with a force cell when testing NHE strength. So from a practical point of view, a force plate can therefore be recommended as an alternative method to assess NHE knee flexor strength in athletes. The ability to test NHE strength with a force plate is valuable, for instance, for researchers, strength professionals, practitioners, or laboratories who already have a force plate or plan to invest in one. And finally, I would like to comment on the force-length relationship when it comes to strength training for injury prevention. So I think that while it's not a bad idea to train at longer muscle fascicle lengths eccentrically to prevent the muscle from injury, I think that it's also very important to train in the safe zone using shorter muscle fascicle length, and also to use eccentric concentric muscle actions. So this is the zone in which the highest force is produced. So I mean, training at longer muscle fascicle length is not optimal for force production or absorption. So I mean, while it's not wrong to train in that zone as well, I think that a lot of training should be performed in the safe zone, both for when it comes to eccentric only training, but also for eccentric concentric training. So that's my comment on the force length relationship. I think that more focus should be on research that was performed in the safe zone when it comes to preventing from muscle injury. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed the video. I think our paper has important clinical relevance for strength coaches and sports physical therapists alike. that uses the Nordic hamstring exercise. See you soon. Bye bye.